más temprano que tarde, de nuevo abrirán las grandes alamedas por donde pase el hombre libre para construir una sociedad mejor.
My name is Juliano Fiori, and I'm the director at Alameda, a new international institute for which we're here tonight today. So I'd like to start by thanking all of you for coming out on this rainy Monday evening and joining us for this event. The voice you heard just now is that of Salvador Allende, the Chilean president, and those were amongst his last words before he died in the midst of a military coup. They're words that I remember vividly. I remember Chile. And yet I was born almost 12 years after the event. I'm a child of exiles from Chile, and I inherited a political memory of that time. It's a memory of violence, of tragedy, also of struggle, and somehow a host. And maybe that's because it's the only future that I've ever known. In fact, for my generation, the last future we've known exists in the past. For some of you, maybe most of you even here today, we were born into a time of the present, a time of presentism, after the dissipation of modern utopias at the end of history. Once politics no longer constituted a dispute to set future expectations, and it was becoming an exercise in the management of risks. Already in September 1973, the main response of resistance to the military coup was a protest politics that was decidedly post-revolutionary. This was the decade in which human rights came to the fore as a cosmopolitan agenda via campaigns against state violence and disappearance and torture. And not unrelated, it was also the decade in which capitalist crisis created opportunities for a preventive counter-revolution that was aimed at crushing organized labor and reasserting a new mode of accumulation that could raise profit rates. It resulted in the implementation of neoliberal policies, deregulating policies, that installed risk at the heart of the welfareized state. As neoliberalism accelerated financialization, the circulation of speculative capital, and deindustrialization, it encouraged the more frequent recurrence of crisis. And in the main, progressives, including those on the left, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of choice, responded by focusing on stabilization, on the maintenance of order, and not primarily to ensure the development of productive forces, but rather to protect a humanitarian minimum of life. Profit rates steadied after their decline in the late 1960s and 1970s, but the informalization of labor, the decentralization of production, contributed to the disintegration of the modern work society and ultimately to the end of what's been called mass politics, mass participation in politics through political parties. Since then, capitalism has become increasingly cannibalistic, destroying its very sources of value, that is, living labor. And so despite claims about sustained development and sustained growth, the end of bust and boom, we've seen, in fact, de-development, a collapse of modernization, initiated on the periphery, increasingly taking hold in the metropolis, in the core of advanced economies. And this is observable here today in spreading precarity, in falling real wages, and in growing unrest. In the wake of the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, popular discontent was expressed through popular mobilizations, mass mobilizations, anti-political insurgencies. But it was movements of the new right that responded most effectively and most ruthlessly to the shock to the prevailing order, not just asserting a reactionary cultural agenda, but also enabling the capture of the state by criminal rackets and by oligarchic interests. In this scenario, we can say that it seems that there's not enough capitalism to go around, that there's a war for work. And contrary to the expectations of progressives, it's politicians that tell it as it is, that champion the expansion of the gig economy, who seem to have gained appeal. For many of those struggling to get by, there's something intuitive about this politics of destruction, a politics of destruction which removes the barriers to a new entrepreneurialism of the self, whether it's deregulating labor that enables app work, or whether it's removing the demarcations from indigenous territories which benefits illegal miners. But this politics of destruction exacerbates existing antagonisms, contributing to chronic social conflict and sometimes even interstate war. It also shortens the course to economic breakdown. It shortens the course to ecological collapse. We've come to know a lot more about ecological degradation, environmental degradation, particularly over the last 2 decades. And so there's a particularly ominous character today to its proliferating effects in the form of droughts and floods that kill and displace people and animals, but also in the form of outbreaks of contagious disease. If there's now an embrace of this politics of destruction, it's this then that marks the entry into a time of catastrophe. A transition which seems to have been confirmed by the war in Ukraine, which has raised once again the spectre of nuclear exchange, of nuclear war. In this time, nuclear holocaust, ecological collapse, and world economic disintegration represent abstract but nonetheless insurmountable threats on the horizon that dominate today our political imagination. And so if that's the case, the allusion to Salvador Allende's Grandes Alamedas, the great avenues to a better society, might seem to be somewhat anachronistic. Allende's speech conjures a modernist imaginary that seems at odds with our contemporary world, which is in deconstruction, substantial deconstruction. And yet there's something of this imaginary that remains absolutely relevant to contemporary struggles for living conditions, struggles for survival. If catastrophe does indeed represent a definitive impasse, its postponement will depend on the construction of new pathways to a better society. And this is not just an idealistic exercise in reimagining utopias. It's work that's based on organization and based on strategy. And so that's what we'd like to contribute at Alameda. To the somewhat apocalyptic diagnosis of the end of things, we respond with a question, which is not just the old question, what is to be done, but it's how can we develop a more strategic concept of the end? That is, after 40 or so years in which progressives have organized around order, what are the possibilities of organizing around endings, around crisis, in pursuit of a better society? This is a radically urgent question, and it demands a response that goes to the root of the problem. And yet today, there are very few opportunities for radical intellectual production that can contribute to this agenda, alongside acts of resistance that provide hope. The university today has been transformed according to a neoliberal logic, which means that it's no longer a space of critique. Meanwhile, most think tanks and NGO research units are often driven by the technocratic demands of policy. And so, while promoting the scholarly rigor of academia, and without disavowing the world of policy, what we plan to do is to promote and enable collective research that's grounded in contemporary social struggles in order to contribute to strategic responses to the critical questions of our time. So how do we plan to go about that? What are activities? What is it we're going to do? The first thing is that we have a secretariat, which is a central coordinating nucleus, and it will coordinate an international network. It's a network of intellectuals and activists and organizers who are working on themes that are of relevance to Alameda's proposition. We've already identified and selected a number of these members of our network, but the idea is that the network will expand gradually over the coming months and years. And in that way, we hope to reach more of the political map than we've currently covered. Secondly, we will coordinate dialogue between members of our network and political and social organizations, from unions to NGOs to social movements to autonomous collectives. In this way, the idea is that researchers don't just engage with organizations at the end point of their projects for dissemination, but that this dialogue can actually produce priorities for research itself. And so the third area of activity is supporting the research projects of those members of our network, particularly when they're focused on addressing the structural questions that are relevant to our proposition. This will be in the form of indirect and direct funding for research projects, funds drawn from different forms of donorship, from foundations to research councils to individual giving from lovely people like yourselves. But it will also involve intellectual exchange between the members of our network, and it will also involve types of mentorship opportunities, particularly for younger researchers. And then finally, we will enable or facilitate publication of the research that's generated within our network, often or primarily through partnerships with existing progressive media outlets and publishing houses. But alongside the publication of written work, we'll also produce videos and podcasts and organize events and study groups that are related to the research of those members of our network. Although the network is international, our secretariat will be split between Brazil and the UK. And we will emphasize, or we'll place emphasis on building ties with organizations in these two locations to start with. This gives us the possibility of having two different vantage points from which to focus our analysis of global dynamics. But also with the intention of promoting ideas from the periphery, we hope to develop ties in South Africa. I'm not going to go into lots of detail about our structure and other activities, because I think on a night like tonight, it's better to actually engage with the substance of what we're trying to produce. So if you'd like more information about Alameda, please go to alameda.institute. Finally, thank you to all of you again. It's a rainy night, it's a Monday, so I really appreciate you coming out. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day, the rest of the evening.